Will I kick us off, Ajay? Or
Oh, yes, everyone is here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us in time. Really happy to have you all with us. This is an exclusive conversation with Girish Menon. Very fond of following his journey. We wanted to understand in this uncertain environment, both around a lot of conflict happening, but also around the funding, which has been a continuous challenge. We wanted to bring in some additional voice to the community and understand where we can support each other in this uncertain times and in this journey together. So thank you very much for joining us. Um, Before I begin, a few things. We're really grateful for your presence. As always, it's a 1 hour conversation. We would encourage and appreciate undivided attention. If you have anything switched on other than this, pause it, keep it on hold. It'll be better. You'll enjoy this conversation much more. And we this conversation is for you, led by you as well. So we have received some questions in the survey, but please feel free to put your questions in the chat while Kavita is moderating and leading the conversation with Girish. But also, if you have any other questions, we'll take it up towards the end as well. We will record the session as well. But before we dive in, we would love to know where you're joining from, for everyone to know who you are and where you're joining from. Really easy to connect. Please put that in the chat box if you can. While you're putting that in the chat box, we have one question for you as well to start us off. If you can share one feeling, it could be a word, it could be two or three, but one feeling you have currently right now with regarding the funding environment we currently experience. So you could phrase your sentences, I feel, or we feel, or however you wished. While you do that, I will take this time to talk about GSF. As you're all familiar, you're part of the GSF community, but collectively we've grown to 169 organizations. Hats off to each one of us. Over 63 countries serving together, 132 plus million plus children, so many schools, so many teachers. Again, it also shakes us, but also allows us to think about and reflect what opportunities we have together to collectively understand and strengthen learning environments across education across the globe. So thank you for strengthening the community. With that, in today's session, we have Girish Menon. I took this picture without asking Girish. So Girish, this you thankfully had shared in the LinkedIn. So since it's 40-year-old journey, starting with your first job, we thought we'll start this journey from there and your amazing 40-year journey. So yeah, as an executive leader, strategic advisor, and so many other roles you've played in. And I'll be happy to introduce Kavita, who's the director at Global Schools Forum, whom you're all familiar with. She'll be leading the discussion and we can take up the questions right as we move ahead. So over to you, Kavita and Girish.
thanks so much, Ajay. And please continue to introduce yourselves in the chat. We'd love to hear where you're from and how you're feeling at the moment. First of all, wanted to say thank you to all of you for being here, but mostly wanted to thank Girish for joining us today. Girish came and spoke to us a couple of months ago when the USAID news came out. And so we wanted to make sure his wisdom is really reaching a larger number of people. So we've organized this second session. So we're quite excited to have all of you and really looking forward to hearing from Girish. Girish has quite significant experience, both leading organizations as well as fundraising for organizations. He's worked as Deputy CEO of WaterAid. He's been CEO of ActionAid UK. He's been CEO of Stir Education in the UK. So really brings a wealth of experience to this discussion. And we're also thrilled to congratulate Girish on his new appointment as the 10th president of Lucy Cavendish College, which he starts in October. So we're quite delighted to have him here. What we are going to do is we had asked some of you to share questions that you have that Girish can start with. So I will get into those questions, but we really do want to keep this a two-way discussion. So at any point, if you have follow-on questions to what Girish is saying, or if you just have additional questions you'd like him to touch upon, please do throw that in the chat. I will monitor the chat and make sure we're bringing that up as we go through the conversation as well. So maybe I will turn over to Girish now for a quick reflection on his journey and really key lessons that he's learned through the process on building funding and fundraising resilience.
Thank you very much, Kavita, and thank you, Ajay, for organizing this event, and also for Ashti, because of whom we are here today as the GSF community. Every time I hear about GSF, I'm super impressed with how much you've grown, and the depth and the breadth of its reach. I mean, I was just looking at the numbers when Ajay put it up there: 1.7 million schools and 132 million children, if I'm not mistaken. It's amazing. It's absolutely stupendous. But it also shows the strength of the community cutting across 3 or 4 continents, which is absolutely amazing. So good afternoon to all of you. I suppose nobody's in the good morning zone as yet, but good afternoon, good evening to wherever you are. It's my pleasure to come here for this session. So to Kavita, your question. Uh, uh, as Ajay put up the slide, even it took me by shock because I don't look so young. You know, that was from 40 years ago, and that's where I started. So roughly 20 years working in India, 20 years being based in the UK, and entirely in the social sector, working across various thematic areas, including education. Also worked on health and livelihoods, and have had special interests in child rights and gender rights. Uh, so the discussion about funding is quite an opportune one, given the various challenges we are seeing right now. If there is one lesson that I've learned, especially when it comes to funding over the years, it's about the power of authenticity. I've seen that where organizations are true to their vision, true to their mission, and true to the values that they are here for, that authenticity is something that has always helped organizations weather any storm. And the reason I talk about authenticity is because it can be quite challenging when donors suddenly have different preferences. You know, suddenly today, if a donor is talking about climate change, tomorrow it could be health system strengthening because of COVID, or climate, or it could be something to do with climate resilience, for instance, or social enterprise, or whatever. Now, when that happens, many organizations do go all around and try to sway in keeping up with the trends of the donors, and that can be very destabilizing for the organizations concerned. But also, it doesn't really put the organization on a very strong wicket, so to say. So that's the one learning that I really like to emphasize, that irrespective of what happens in the ecosystem, we need to stay true to who we are, what we do, and what we're here to achieve.
Thank you, Girish. That's really good, a really good place to start. And it actually leads us really nicely into the first set of questions. So just for everyone listening, we're doing questions in kind of 2 broad buckets. One, thinking around how do we diversify funding and how do we align to the donors in general. And then the second bunch of questions that we've received from participants is around resilience and long-term planning. So this leads really nicely into one of the questions that we've gotten from one of the participants, which is, how do organizations, especially now, align your mission with funder priorities without compromising core values and without making significant shifts to program, like you spoke about, Girish?
Yeah. So so let me just build on this thing of authenticity. Now, let us say we are doing an education program, and let us say, for example, and I'm quoting some from real experiences, some from experiences that I've heard from other colleagues. Now, let's say you meet a set of donors, and let's say, for instance, that though you are focused on education, they are talking of climate change, and they suddenly, and you would have heard this phrase many often from them: oh, we are doing a strategy review, our board has decided to reprioritize, and all our funding is now going to climate change. Now, you're in the education sector, and the leap from the education sector to the climate change sector can seem quite massive and possibly insurmountable unless you actually do stuff on climate change. My approach, talking to some of my colleagues in the past, has been we don't have to change what we do, but how can we show that what we are doing in education is relevant for climate change? So, for example, what does climate change impact look like for the education sector? What is the education sector doing to prepare its children and the teachers and the education system better to meet with some of the risks of climate change? So, in doing so, you're not actually changing your programming. Your programming is solid, and you need that solid programming because that's how you're rooted, that's where you're embedded, that's where you draw your identity from, that's where you draw your evidence from of all the work that you have done. Suddenly, if we were all to sort of become climate change organizations, it's not that simple. It's all about skills and expertise, and what our journey has been and what our history has been. But climate change is real, and we know that it is going to impact everyone on this planet. It's definitely going to impact children. So if we're looking at it from a children's perspective, what do children need to know more and different about climate change today than what they knew about 5 years ago, 10 years ago? What is it that teachers need to be better prepared for? So for example, if there are climate events that are going to disrupt the academic calendar, how are they going to help children navigate those crises and make sure that their learning outcomes are still sustained? What does it mean for the education system that may now be deprived of funding because maybe governments are also putting more money into climate resilience or environment and not enough for education? But education might need more funding actually to adjust themselves to some of the risks and dangers of climate change. So that's just one example. But if we can show and demonstrate that what we do is relevant for the donor priorities, then we can start building a narrative around that.
Thanks, Girish. And I think good point about both aligning while holding on to your authentic voice, but maybe taking a step back. If as an organization, this is the time that we start planning our own diversification of funding and fundraising sources, how do I go about it? So how do organizations start thinking about effective strategies for diversifying funding beyond traditional donors?
Mhm. So let me start by saying that diversification is absolutely important and absolutely critical. And many of the organizations who are now caught in this USAID crisis, some of them is also because probably not much thinking has gone into the diversification. But that applies to everyone in the sector, not just those who are affected by USAID funding. The second thing to say is that diversification is a long-term process, and it's not something that can happen overnight. So let me narrate what we tried to do when I was with WaterAid back in the day. So this is now going back. So I was with WaterAid from 2005 to 2015. While WaterAid continued to have very good income from individuals, or let's say the voluntary income, I think the writing was very clear on the wall that this is not going to last. Public funding or voluntary fundraising is not going to last, and it may not help. It may help sustain the existing programs, but it will not help it grow if you really want to grow. Because there was at that time a lot of growth in institutional funding, including DFID, which was there at that time, including USAID. And there was increased funding from corporate foundations, philanthropists, high net worth individuals, etc. And we felt that as an organization that had got so used to or so comfortable with unrestricted funding, if we really wanted to grow, we need to be more and more comfortable with restricted funding. So I'll just narrate a few key steps that we did, and let me tell you, this we did over about 5 year time frame. So it's not a quick fix, but I can just point out a few things that we did. The first thing was for the programs, finance, and fundraising team to work together, and it had to be a strategy that was driven by all the three of them. It couldn't just be a financing strategy. It couldn't just be a fundraising strategy. It just couldn't be a programming strategy. These three teams had to work together to get to a same place. That was number one. Number two, we knew that so I was leading the program side. 65% of the funding came from unrestricted sources, and only 35 came from restricted sources. We knew that if we had to sustain and grow, we need to flip. It had to be 65% restricted and 35% unrestricted, because that's where the growth was coming in. Now, what did that mean? That meant that we had to look at where were the different pods and where are the capacities needed. So, as an organization, we were very strong in voluntary fundraising, but we were not very weak on institutional fundraising. We didn't have a corporate partnership team that was really good. We were reasonably okay in trusts and foundations. So we had to have an organizational strategy looking at where are the capacity gaps and where do we put in more funding. Then we talked about systems and processes. We found that our finance systems were not good enough for the kind of restricted money that we wanted to attract, because there was much tighter accountability requirements, especially when you're getting money from the EU. There's always a chance that some element of your budget will be disallowed because you didn't spend enough, you didn't spend well enough or efficiently enough. So how do you create a small pot for disallowable expenses? And the last thing that we did, I'm kind of, in the interest of time, I'm just quickly racing through what we did over 5 years. The last thing that we did, which was very important, was to look at behaviors within the organization and how do you incentivize the right behaviors so that people can really go out and tap into the fundraising potential. So we did a look at all the countries where we are implementing programs. We looked at in country opportunities, because many donors, for example, the Swiss and the Swedes and the Danes, they had started putting money into what's called the national pots, which was held in the relevant embassy of the country. So, for example, in an embassy in Bangladesh. So we had to see what is the, because traditionally country programs were involved in implementing programs and policy work, but they were not very much involved in fundraising. How can you incentivize national teams to also go in for the fundraising so that they're just not dependent on a central team sitting, let's say, in London or wherever, to look for funds? What does that mean in terms of providing them with a safety net, because things could go wrong? So how do you help them navigate through that? So we have to think about those kinds of incentives to motivate the right behaviors that will enable country teams to not just shift their thinking and reliance from unrestricted to restricted funding, but also to look at local opportunities. As I said, it's a really quick rush through to what happened over 5 years.
No, that's very helpful though, because I do think it's interesting pointers that you're giving. What I'm taking away from it is a long-term process. So while there is uncertainty happening right now with funding, it's worthwhile for all of us to be thinking about the next 5 to 10 years for our organizations, because some of this change is going to take time. And I think the other interesting piece that you're bringing up is how embedded fundraising is within the organizational structures and processes and working with the teams. So very, very helpful guidance. And I do want to say to anyone listening, if you have additional strategies that you have implemented in your organizations, or if you have follow-on questions, please do put that in the chat. I think we're all collectively learning as we go through this. So next question, and I know I'm jumping questions, but it's because we've had these sent to us in advance. So for smaller organizations that are looking to grow, oftentimes funders don't come in with large pots of money for new ambitious projects that they would like to launch. So what would you recommend for smaller organizations that are looking to grow and scale their programs, sometimes substantially larger than where they are at right now?
So just so that I understand the question, Kavita, it's about how smaller organizations can set on this pathway to growth.
That's one, and attract. So let's say, for example, the organizations that are $500,000 budget right now, but they want to move towards programs that are maybe $2.5 million. So how do you think about and attract funders that will support that growth?
Yeah, that's not an easy question at all. You can hear me, right? Yeah.
Yeah,
So Yeah, that's not an easy question at all. But let me just link it to what you just said a little while ago in terms of a longer term fundraising strategy. And again, I would say that it has to be an organizational commitment rather than the commitment of just the fundraising team or the fundraising colleagues. So the first thing to think about is, what is the strategic rationale for growth? Uh, I mean, are we pushing growth for the sake of growth, or is there a real reason why we want to grow? Is there a real reason for us to operate at a particular scale? What is it we are not able to do if we don't grow? And sometimes organizations haven't done enough thinking on that, which means that the growth narrative tends to be quite weak. That's one thing that funders always have asked me in the past. And if you don't have a narrative on that, then you just can't say, because I've been around for 5 years and I've been at a $500,000 budget, I would like to become 1 million. But the question is why. So I think that's the first important thing that has to come right from the governance level of the organization. It has to be a very key strategic consideration. Is growth right for the organization? And if so, why growth, and how will that growth be managed and over what period of time? So those are key questions that I'd encourage colleagues to think about before we actually talk to the funders, because the funders have seen all kinds of organizations, right? And so they're going to ask you these very, very tough questions. Again, to give an example, uh, when I was the program director for WaterAid, we had 15 country programs. We wanted to have more presence in Africa, and we wanted to go to 8 new countries in Africa. Now, we did a fairly good study and a research and a desk study and all that stuff, but we really didn't develop a narrative on why did we want to go into more countries in Africa, and why would these countries meet the specifications, and why not others. And that's when we realized that our narrative is not strong enough. At least I realized that our narrative is not very strong enough. So we had to really think very carefully: is it growth for the sake of growth, or is it growth for actually achieving a certain impact at scale? The third thing is then to look at the partnerships. How are we planning this growth? Is it a growth that is driven by the organization, or is it some form of a collective growth where we're working in consortium with other organizations and therefore pitching it forward? So the first thing I would say is that have the strategic plan for growth very, very clear, and also the kind of impact. Donors, as we now know, are really pushing on the impact button a lot more than what they did, let's say, even 5 or 10 years ago. So what is the expected impact of that growth? Moving on, I would say, so I'm all for ambition, right? I think donors love that ambition, but that means that it's also how you communicate that ambition. People would have heard about things like the Audacious Project and all that, for example. So it'll be worthwhile looking at some of these organizations who have been on the journey, and everyone will tell you that that journey has been really very tough, but it's been worthwhile. It's been worthwhile because it really pushed them to think about some of these big key strategic questions in a very robust manner. Uh, how do you profile yourself as an organization is also really important. Do we have people within an organization who are going to be out and about meeting these donors, if not face to face, but also virtually? How do you make the presence of the organization felt so that the donors also start coming looking for you? I was quite interested. I mean, when I was at Stir, it was quite interesting where at least 2 donors that I can remember came to us rather than we going to them, because they had seen us speak at some event, or they had seen something that was out on social media or on our websites. And I think that's really, really important to see how do you position your organization for that kind of a growth. So growth for me is a strategic conversation. The actual funding bit of it is the mechanism of growth. It's not growth per se. It's a pathway to growth. So I think my advice to organization would be to really invest time and energy, both from the boards and from the senior leadership team and across the organization, on what is the strategic rationale for growth. How do you want to grow? Where do you want to grow? What will that quality and pace of growth look like? What are the partnerships in there? What are the communications and the positioning for that growth? And finally, what is the impact we would like to achieve as a result of the growth? If you have that narrative right, and if we continue to network, you are going to hit the right audiences with those kinds of questions and responses.
Super helpful, Girish. Thank you. And I think you're helping us look at funding as a mechanism rather than funding as the end goal, which is really a good perspective for all of us to look at. I'm going to take a couple of questions that have come through the chat before we move into the next set. So Mia from Amala Education, I think when you were talking about working with your local teams and country teams, the question she has is, she's curious about the more specific behaviors you were trying to nurture to help look for more local funding.
So, so it goes without saying that there are some countries and if you have a global program, there are some countries and there are some individuals within countries who tend to be more enterprising, right? So one was to actually try to look out for people who have the sense of enterprise to God, because fundraising requires people with a lot of enterprise. It requires us to put ourselves out there. It's about pitching, it's about networking, and it's also looking for the right opportunities. We can't wait for donors to come to us just because we have a good product. We need to go out there. So that's one thing that we did to see, are there leadership, like country directors, for instance, or senior leaders who are really interested and want to go out there. And we did have people who constantly bang us, on the table and say, listen, we have this opportunity. And in the past you say, no, but that's for the London team to decide, but we are fundraising here, you can't, because if you do, the quality. So we said, no, hang on. So we need an overall change in the behaviors. Why should fundraising be such a sacrosanct thing? At the end of the day, what we want with fundraising is we want a very good program, we need very good delivery, we need very good communication, we need very good relationships. So it need not be just in London or New York, everywhere. Anyone can do it. So that is one shift in behavior, because there is always an element of risk. Like, if you're a London-based organization and if you're fundraising in Ghana, how will it impact on the global brand? And fair, that's your internal problem. You need to sort that out. But you can't be risk averse. Okay, you need to be aware of the fact that we might then have a different voice in Ghana, a different voice in Sri Lanka, a different voice in Kenya, wherever. You can't have that, because if you're one global organization, you need to have the same voice. So it's more about trying to look at what is a risk that you're afraid of, and how can you mitigate that risk. So that was the other behavior of trying to, again, reframe risks, so that don't look at these as risks, look at these as opportunities, and then find ways to mitigate that risk, whether it's about branding, whether it's about communication, whether it's about capacity. The third thing is this whole thing of dependency, that, because you're a country program, we are here only to implement programs, or fundraising is your responsibility, but then we need another 10% or 20% increase in budgets for growth. So my point was, listen, we'll underwrite some of your budgets, but if you want to grow, you grow on your own steam. You can't grow on our steam, because our global pot is meant for all the countries. So again, it was a question of incentivizing, but the question then was, instead of penalizing them and saying, no, I won't give you the budget, it's like, what can I do, or what can I invest in, so that you guys can be better in fundraising? Right now, of course, I'm not a fundraiser, but I could say I can leverage the fundraising knowledge in our teams. So some country teams did come up and say, listen, can your fundraising colleagues from the institutional fundraising department, can they come and do a 1-week training for our staff on how to do a log frame, how to identify a results framework, how to do blah blah, whatever, and I said, yeah, now we are talking. Yeah, so that's exactly so rather than saying that's your responsibility, this is my responsibility, I won't do, you have to do this, it's an organizational thing. Because if you raise more funds for your country, that's more funds for your country. It's more empowering, it's more enabling, it's more enterprising. It also means that we have some of the global funds left for countries where fundraising or in-country fundraising potential is very limited. So again, for the country directors, and this is the last bit here, trying to make them think global, right? Okay, you might be the country director for Bangladesh or Uganda, but you also need to think global, because by doing this, you're actually supporting the organization and raising it. And especially for institutional fundraising, it is very important, because every relationships would matter. we knew, for example, in one particular case, when I was trying to raise money from DFID in Nigeria, I found that there was a bit of a block there. And when I went and found out what the issue was, this person had been with DFID in another country where our organization had messed up the relationship, right? So he came with the same understanding that, oh, so I'm going to have the same problem as I face in that particular country. So it also required that change in behaviors to think global, that you might be working in 5 countries and you might be the team leader for country X, right? But anything that you do, your actions, your behaviors is going to impact on the whole organization in ways that you may not even realize. So it's a mix of some hardcore stuff around funding and fundraising, something around capacity, but also something on nurturing relationships and thinking global.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's also about thinking about what changes need to happen at the country level teams, but also what changes need to happen at the global headquarter team, etc., and making sure they're both connecting.
Yeah. May I also add again, so that I don't miss the point, the boards at whichever level are equally important, because again, many times the boards are the ones who form a blockage, because boards tend to be more risk averse, right? And the moment they're talking to somebody else doing the fundraising on behalf of the organization or not in the central team, they're a bit worried. So it's about calming the board down and saying, no, you also need to support us.
Yeah, and maybe that is, I know it's not in my list of questions for you, Girish, but since you brought up the board, maybe we can take a question around that, which is, again, like, what is the most effective way to leverage your board, especially now when funding is, I mean, we're going to see the trickle-down effects of the USAID and FCDO cuts, for example. So what can the board do to support both country teams and headquarter teams? And what have you done with your boards that you have worked with?
Okay, so I know there are some CEOs on this call, and if I ask any CEO what's one of the biggest frustration, I won't be surprised if most of them say to get boards engaged in fundraising is one of the most frustrating thing. I can't see the chats, so I don't know if there are any chats that support what I say. Please do shout out and let me know. But it's always been a difficult thing. But at the same time, I've seen boards where they actually are supportive, but they are, I would say that's like in 20% of the cases, if at all. But what can they do? Number one, many of them, they come from let's say a private sector background or a business sector background, and they are good in challenging our thinking on efficiency indicators, which is what donors often look at, like, like, okay, what's the cost of delivery and those kinds of things. So it'll be it's always good if you're not if you're not sure of the quality or the robustness of your proposal, and if you're going to a new donor, and let's say the new donor, it's the let's say the charitable arm of an investment bank, you can expect them to be like hardcore number crunchers out there who are looking at all these indicators. But at the same time, a treasurer on the board who's very comfortable with numbers and who have worked with big banks or law firms or whatever can help vet the robustness of the proposal. We don't often tap into that kind of an expertise. We go into board meetings, meeting papers, documents, meeting done, decisions made out. But we can say, can you just play the role of a challenger for this particular proposal? The second thing, which I think is really very valuable, is the contacts and networks. And it's constant. You just need to nag your board members every now and then and keep on nagging them and say, can you open this door, can you open that door? I've seen a couple of good practices where every month the fundraising team will send a little mail uh, of what they call the top 5 prospects or top 10 prospects, and they'll send it to all the board members. We think that these are good prospects for us to fundraise from. They might be a law firm, they might be a company, they might be a food and beverages thing, a chain, or they might be a philanthropic foundation or a trust. They will send this list of top 5 or top 10 prospects to all the all the trustees, and they'll put some names against that in terms of who are the people I'm trying to get in touch with in these organizations, and they'll send it around to the board members so that the board members might ignore it 3 times, 4 times, fifth time there's a sense of guilt and say, okay, let me try and find at least one contact for them. Many people don't do that, but I've seen where people do that, they have good results, because in the fundraising teams, not to be left behind, would then actually call the board member and say, oh John, so I sent this mail to you and I wondered if you had a moment to look at it. And now John will feel guilty about it, and now let me do something and find someone, even if it's not in the 10, I'll find somebody else. You have to nag board members, otherwise they don't really come up. I don't blame them as well, because they've got a full-time life as well, so they sometimes just forget or they don't have time, which is why we can't say, oh, poor board members are giving time on a voluntary basis, let me not ask them. No, you don't ask, you don't get. Crying baby always gets more milk. So you have to go for that. What else? So sometimes board members also help in now, this is not directly related to fundraising, but if there's a board member who works in a very nice office, you can have, let's say, a board meeting in their office premises, or you can even have a staff development day in their office. And what happens is that, and I've seen that on a couple of occasions, it raises the profile of that organization, because suddenly the rest of the people see that there's some other group here, and it gets talking, and sometimes that has led to things like they're voting for this organization for the charity of the year, kind of a thing. So sometimes we look at board members only as generating income, but then there are different other ways. Tap into their expertise, tap into their networks, tap into their things of ideas. Now currently many organizations are looking at things like a social enterprise model for raising own funds. It's not fundraising, but it's to generate more income, or a consulting arm for the organization to generate a self-earned income. Or some of them are even now talking of impact investments and bonds, developing impact bonds, etc. So for all of these, try to look around the board and see who may have the right networks to do that. Sometimes it's also come through very non-financial ways, as one of the board members requesting the organization to host some people for the internship, as part of the voluntary or staff engagement program. And that has then led to the organization being known a little bit more, and these employees actually now going and fundraising for this organization.
Thanks, Girish. And your initial statement elicited a lot of smiles amongst people that I can see. So it sounds like it is a very familiar narrative that you are speaking about. Before I go into the next set of questions, I did want to see if anybody in our audience wants to unmute and ask Girish questions on yourself. Are there other questions on this particular topic around diversification that anybody wants to dig into? Otherwise, I have more questions for Girish in our plan. So I'll give maybe like 15 seconds to see if anybody wants to come off mute and ask questions. Go ahead, Matthew.
I figure if I'm the only one on video, I'll jump the queue. Yes, thank you, Girish. That's really interesting insight. I've made a lot of notes there. But I guess my question is around education funding. And we've seen, I would say, seismic shifts in the funding landscape in the last few months. Funding is not going to be working as it once was, and the funding isn't there. Funding may move to these more kind of humanitarian crisis response type scenarios. I guess we're an organization, Children in Crossfire, who are focused on early childhood education, and especially in development settings, especially. And how do we, I guess, collaborate with others to bring attention to the importance of this space, in terms of, you might not have so many wars if children were better educated and more resilient, etc., etc. And is there any kind of value in that? I mean, to some level, we compete for funding as different organizations. At another level, we need to protect the pie of funding into education. Nutrition, children dying of malnutrition is much more poignant and appealing to all sorts, voters, fundraisers, etc., than education. So what advice might you have for those of us who are working in this education space in terms of bringing attention to it, to protect that money and grow that money for funding?
Right.
Thank you.
That's a very interesting question, Matthew. So let me reflect on the time when I sat on the board of the Disasters Emergency Committee, DEC, which has 15 members. And the more you were elaborating on a question, the more I realized that in all the humanitarian conversations, there was very little of education related program talk, or even in the proposals. So there was a lot on the immediate food, water, shelter. So wash was very important, medicines, and food and nutrition was very important, but there wasn't much on education. And maybe there were just a couple of organizations who would occasionally talk about post-trauma counseling for children, but there wasn't really a push from the education community. So it just makes me think that there is possibly an opportunity for education organizations to work with the humanitarian community. And maybe DEC could be a start, because you then have a captive audience of 15 organizations. But if that's going to be difficult, pick out some of the large ones like Save Oxfam, Plan, and others, and they all have a humanitarian lead. And it'd be worthwhile trying to get in touch with the humanitarian lead and push the education envelope a lot more, because I completely agree that the argument of children being better educated might reduce wars might be a bit more difficult to make. But what we do know is that when wars happen, even if it's a very low level conflict, and let's not even talk about war, even if it's a localized conflict, schools are affected, education systems are affected, and that impacts on the learning outcomes, that impact on the well-being of children. So possibly there's a strong narrative to be made in the with the humanitarian community, and see how education is a bit more mainstream than it currently is. To the best of my knowledge, and just as you explained it, I don't think it's that core and central when it comes to humanitarian programming.
No, I mean, there are education in emergencies type initiatives and things like that. I guess my question was more around the funding, which is reducing, is going to more humanitarian crisis response type areas, especially climate change, and away from longer term development programs. And how might we try and protect that space there or build that space there? Because economic development, better learning outcomes for children, we know this creates more stable, more resilient populations. And I guess my fear in a relatively small NGO is we're just going to get squeezed out 5 years from now or something.
I mean, that risk is real.
Mm.
That risk is indeed real. But I still think that there is. I mean, it goes back to the education climate change point that I was making at the beginning. If we're able to draw a very strong sense of narrative around why our work matters in the changing geopolitics or the environmental situation, whether it's humanitarian or whether it's for long-term development, that's where possibly there is a potential answer. Because what we know is that the funding is not going to grow, at least in the short to medium term. The funding is going to be tight, and there will be a lot of demand on the immediate impact of a humanitarian situation, not just wars and conflict, but also if we talk of earthquakes or floods or things like that. So the point is about how can we make our work a lot more relevant to what's happening even within the humanitarian context, rather than show it as an either or kind of a situation. Because what is really frustrating with many of the donors is that they do not seem to have the patience to invest in something that's longer term in terms of building resilience, which is why a lot of it is about how do you look at the immediate impact, what's happening, and once the donor comes through the door, then bring them along this journey on this longer term resilience. But going back to what I was trying to say earlier, I still think that there's an opportunity to talk to some of the other multi-sectoral organizations. So yes, of course, we have Education Can't Wait and others, but that still is seen in a bit of a silo rather than part of the mainframe. And there is possibly something to be done in terms of having those conversations with those more, what would you call, a multi-sectoral programming organizations to then have them also vouch for the importance and relevance of education in these contexts.
Yeah, thanks, Girish. And I think
Thank you. Yeah.
and thanks, Matthew, for the question. I do think it's a very, very real question. And I think a related question around shrinking funding is the one that we're seeing, which is the very real impact of decisions being made, like USAID cutting funding to basic education. A lot of the European development funds are also getting cut. They're being reallocated to defense spending and things like that. So Chavi's question, and Chavi's from Mobile Crushes, her question is, as international funders or governments, also funders directed by governments, are making policies to discourage funds going out of country. I think it's a very real concern that people are grappling with at the moment. Again, I don't know if you have immediate actionable ideas on that, but just how does an organization think about the fact that international funding that all of us are reliant on might start getting smaller and possibly trickling out?
Mm. So I was in another conversation sometime back on looking at localization, for instance. So when we're talking localization, we're talking of the conversation is slightly different. It's about shifting of power. It's about decision making. It's about making sure that local actors also have an equal voice in this. And interestingly, we were having this discussion in the context of USAID cuts, but also cuts by many other governments. There was a sense in the room that this might actually be a right push for localization to actually put in a case. So yes, so many governments, for instance, are not keen on sending money internationally. Equally, some governments are not keen to receive international funding as well, and they create barriers for money coming from outside. So is there an opportunity to, again, reframe the relationship within the philanthropic community within the country to talk about the imperative that is there? So, for example, if there's a policy imperative on universal education, how can the civil society sector engage with the corporate foundations or trusts and philanthropies, or even the general public within that country if those opportunities arise? Now, again, there are no easy answers to it at all, but it's to see what now is going to the market. Now, as I was mentioning in a different context, a problem is a problem only if it has a solution. If it doesn't have a solution, then it's a statement of fact. It stops being a problem. So if the statement of fact is that money is drying up and there are barriers to money coming and going, we need to just accept the fact that at least in the short term, that's going to be, or even the medium term, that's going to be the case. How then do we look at other avenues in terms of new opportunities? But then what is it? How? So, for example, now, again, this might be slightly a long-winded thing. Businesses in any country would talk about skill shortages in the country. Now, that skill shortage, one of the ways to address a skill shortage, to invest in the education, the capabilities of students coming out of the education system. So there's a quid pro quo here. Like, if you really want that local talent, and if you're really mourning about the fact that you don't have enough local talent, but you have a corporate foundation that is doing, let's say, something else, how can they repurpose that money to actually invest in the skills of young people in that country or in that community, so that they benefit, but equally the local community also benefits? And I know that some local organizations have been trying to make the case on things that there's a common language and understanding of. So, for example, if we do talk about uh, well-being of children, it may not be a language that resonates well with some potential donors. So can we find a common ground there without changing what we are doing? And again, I'm not advocating for us to change what we say or what we do, because then we are not being authentic. But can we come up with a different communication strategy, or different set of messages that resonate with people who have certain priorities? So that again goes back to the very first question you asked, Kavita, of how do you align with funder priorities? The best way to align with the funder priorities is to try and see how we can make this tactical communication leap rather than change the entire programming that we do. So yeah, so if you're serious about localization, then possibly there's an opportunity, however painful that is, to see how can local funding sustain a lot more. Where then the international funding can help is to focus on the building of capacities and systems within the national context, because that has been highly underinvested in the past. I can talk, for example, when I was at ActionAid, there was still a lot of dependence, pretty much I would say 70 to 80% of dependence on the global north for funding, because they always felt that, okay, we'll find at some other point in time, we'll invest in some of the other countries. Now, as a country, Vietnam always wanted to more investments so that they could raise more funding in country, because they knew that there was a potential. But for that, you need to really invest upfront so that they're able to raise income in a particular country. The central team didn't think that they had a very strong business case, and they eventually lost out an opportunity, I don't think. And things have just got worse since then. So I think now there might be lots of heads being scratched and said, if only we'd invested more in the likes of a Vietnam or a Brazil or whatever, we could have had more money. So I think it's, as I said, no easy answers in there, because these are all very difficult times. In addition to the complexity, there are these real barriers to movement of money, whether receiving international money or sending international money. How can we find some of the local opportunities which are closer to the communities we work with?
Thank you, Girish. Very helpful as always. I think we have time for one more longish question or two short questions from the audience. So again, let me take 10 seconds to see if anybody has other questions to come in on. I assume people are taking in a lot of information. So let me ask one question before we wrap, which is, I think this question around resilience keeps coming up, and you did talk about the fact that funding and fundraising strategy is a 5-year at minimum plan that you're putting out. But within the organization, how do we start building operational resilience to manage funding volatility?
So let's say the starting point is that funding environment will be volatile, and it'll be it's become more challenging. It always was volatile, but it's just become more uncertain and more volatile now. A few things that I can think of is often sometimes the rest of the organization is not aware of how difficult funding is, because staff are invariably in a program delivery mode or a campaigning or a policy influencing mode. It's often done by the team leader or the CEO or the exec director of an organization. And then when there's an issue with funding, it shakes up the organization and causes a lot of stress. I think it'll be important to just normalize those conversations in your regular meetings, so that funding is not seen as something that sits in the corner that only that team is worried about, or the CEO or whoever is worried about, but it's an organizational thing. So I remember at Stir, on many occasions, we just started normalizing these conversations by just making it open, so that it doesn't come as a shock. I mean, it's hard anyway, right? But it can, that hard push, the delivery of the hard push can be smoothened a little bit once people know that it's not an ambush, but then it's an evolving situation. That's number one. Number two was it's always interesting to see how there can be a lot of innovative ideas that come up from a whole range of people from within, when you know that there's a challenging situation. And sometimes they come from very unpredictable quarters within an organization, because that person has been sitting in the finance team. Now, what is a finance person going to know about fundraising? But you find some really good suggestions from there. For example, a finance person can come up with some really good suggestions on efficiency of cost, or better cost recovery to be incorporated in a project proposal, which means that you are protecting your unrestricted income and trying to raise more money from the restricted income. We have seen a lot of colleagues going online a lot and trying to promote the profile of the organization through being more smart with the LinkedIn, and trying to come up with ideas of webinars and others where they bring in other people to profile the work that they're doing. Now, these are all these all don't directly relate in a pound to pound or a dollar to dollar equivalent in terms of returns. But what it's doing is that it's trying to promote the organization, position the organization, but also build that resilience that it's a shared problem within the organization. And again, I would always stress on the role of the boards in this. The boards have because boards often tend to just ask questions on what's happening in the fundraising rather than be part of the solution. How can the senior leadership team really invite the board members to be part of the solution? Because senior leadership team members are not magicians. They just can't open a tap and let the money flow in. It's a common problem, and they need to push back to the board and say, hang on, it's not us versus them. It's not, okay, fine, you hold us accountable to deliver on these targets, but what is it that you can do to come in and help us raise more funds? The other thing that I always have in the past encouraged people to do is that when you're doing a program, try to think of what part of the program is absolutely core. Like, without that, this program is not worth doing. You need to really protect those investments. What is it that is desirable? And what is it that is aspirational or ambitious? So if you try to think of it in those three scenarios, when push comes to shove, you know exactly what taps to turn off without actually decimating your program, right? So for example, if you're delivering an early childhood care program, your frontline people who deliver the program are your absolute key. They're your key resource. You cannot sacrifice them, because if you sacrifice investing in them or that part of the program, then you're lost. But what you might be able to do, what is desirable is, it would have been nice if they had every monthly meeting in a central place where they actually come and we pay for the transportation, fine. So that's a desirable one. The program will still run if the trainings are switched off, right? It will have some impact in terms of motivation, engagement and all that, but it will not affect the fundamental program. And yeah, it'd be great if you could also do a research on the program, right? But we are not doing a research on the program for the time being because we don't have funds to do that, blah blah blah. So I think encouraging program staff, because often I've seen that program staff have tend to de-link themselves from the funding and the financing part of the equation, because they feel, and I'm saying that because I was a program person myself and I know how we think, right? So instead of saying that, but that's your problem, you need to give us we have submitted the budgets have been approved, you need to fund us. Part of the resilience is also about how program people come up with these kinds of answers or part of the solution to some of these challenges, where they say, okay, if funding becomes a challenge, this is what we need, this is what we can put on the back burner, that's what we can actually push out. But yes, just normalize it, because it's going to be a hard drill for at least some time, and that might possibly work. But again, I'll insist, get the boards involved. Don't let them off the hook.
100%. And I think I would love to take Ashti and Mercy's question, which is really how we build stronger collaboration and coordination across organizations. But maybe that is a discussion, that's a whole hour's worth of discussion. I do recognize that people have to drop off on the hour. So I wanted to say a couple of things. One, a huge, massive thank you to Girish for taking the time to join us. And as I'm thanking Girish, please do take the poll that Ajay has just popped up. But I think we're all trying to navigate this funding uncertainty at this point. So if any of you have suggestions or ideas that you'd like to share, please do also use the GSF WhatsApp group or the GSF snapshot to share some of the questions that you have and some of the things that you've tried out. I think this is, Girish has given us a lot to think about. I think Ajay has posted the blog that we published a month ago with more insights from Girish, but we're also continuing this conversation on funding and financing. On the 29th, we are doing a webinar on communicating impact and securing sustainable financing. We're going to have 3 members of the GSF community come in and talk about that. So please do join for that session as well. We recognize that fundraising is a really, really critical, top of mind topic at this point. So we will continue to engage. But thank you all for being here. And Girish, as always, wonderful session with you. Thank you for making the time for GSF. Every time we reach out, you say yes without hesitating. So we really do appreciate your support.
Thank you very much, Kavita and Ajay and Ashti, and yeah, let's hope we all come out stronger through this phase. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and we will follow up with videos and notes from today's session. Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.